lab, and actually the 5th event of Move It, Youth Mobility in a Digital Era. And this is an online event, or better to say, a series of online events organized by several partners. We have Jugend für Europa, which is the national agency for Erasmus Plus Youth in Action and European Solidarity Corps here in Germany. There is IAP, the International Youth Service of the Federal Republic of Germany, the Estonian Youth Work Center, and Werke, which is the Center of Expertise for Digital Youth Work in Finland, and also the Finnish national agencies for the same EU mobility programs. And today, as I said, it's the 3rd of 4 labs in total, and my name is Marina. I'm one of the facilitators. Some of you already get to know Tuey Valdes. He will come back. And our topic today is social inclusion and digitalization. And we are very happy to have 2 guests and you here. We all together want to explore a bit more about possibilities and challenges too in the frame of European mobility programs and European youth work in general, when it comes to social inclusion and digitalization. But before I tell you a little bit more about how the event is kind of structured, we use Zoom, as you are here already, and just to tell you a few things. We will record this event. So this lab is recorded, just for you to know. We would like to have it for documentation, but also may, after editing a bit, to also offer it to people who couldn't join today. Yeah, great. And then there is this software we use, Zoom, as the video conference, and it offers us a few functions. And as you can see in the very bottom of your screen, there is this black bar, and you see in the very left the mic, which you can turn on and off. So you can mute yourself, and we are also happy if you do that, as long as others speak. If not, we are also going to do it in order to avoid some background noises, yeah? So that we understand the ones who are talking. There's also a little camera, so you can switch on and off your video if you want. We are, of course, happy to see a few faces. That makes it more feeling like we are in a room in a way. Yes, and then you see participants, which are 2 little figures. If you click on it, then you will see on the right side the people who are joining, the names they give themselves. And then down there, under these names, there are little icons. And the blue hand is actually the one which maybe you are going to use in the Q&A part, if you want to raise a question or a comment by using your voice, yeah? Great. There's also the chat window. So if you click on the little chat, then this is also on the right side. The chat is opening, and this is where you can introduce yourself, of course. You can comment all the time when we have our talks, and you can also send your comments and questions there for the Q&A part. We have a team, and also Ivaldas and me, we will collect your questions. There's nothing get lost. So in order you don't want to raise your voice, you can also send the question there. And then one last thing is our speakers will going to share their screen in order to show some presentation. Then Zoom is maybe a bit changing, and you don't have this gallery or speaker view anymore. You see the presentation actually, and then some of you may have a smaller screen. So if the presentation is too big, you can go in the very up in the center and put options and click on fit to window, and it will just be for your size of the screen. And you can also control these little windows of speakers for yourself. So you can show just the speaker, the one head, or more, or even none, if you want to see the whole slide. Yeah, great. That's about the technical issues. Anything you have, you just write also in the chat if you have a question on these topics. What we are going to do today. So a few people have already joined the other labs, so it's quite similar to the ones. So we share a slide with you which shows the agenda of today's event. So after we are finishing our introduction here, We will have a talk by Adina, Marina, ṭERBAN from the Center for Sustainable Community in Romania, and followed by a talk by Dan MOXON from People, Dialogue and Change in the UK. And there are some comprehensive questions which you can ask immediately. If not, everything content-wise will go into the next part, which are questions and answers. And then in the last 10 minutes, around 10 minutes, we are getting some feedback by you and telling you what's coming next. And we are finished around 3:30. Yeah, great. We will have probably a little energizer in between in order to feel fresh all the time, the whole 1.5 hours. Great. So I think now we want to know who else is here.
Welcome from my side too. I'm Evaldas Rupkos, and I'm glad to see that we already have 80 participants here on board. So feel free to exchange in chat, and today we have some surprises for you ready, where you can keep on communicating and building up this communication of those who are interested in digital youth mobility. So now I would like to invite you to either open a browser or to take a mobile device and go to the website menti.com and then enter the code 512790 512790. So go on menti.com in your browser, best in your mobile device, and enter 512790 and let us know in which city or area you are at the moment. Seems to be a big city of Germany. We see somebody near Manchester, in Maribor in Slovenia, in Tbilisi in Georgia, Alessandria in Italy, Vilkaviškis in Lithuania, Düsseldorf, Kuopio in Finland most probably. Great, thank you. Many in Berlin, some in Amsterdam, Toulouse, Helsinki, Cologne is also here, Thessaloniki, Ghent, Abruzzo. Wow, lovely. So many different parts of Europe. Thank you for sharing. Let's have a look at the further question. So once again on menti.com, under the code 512790, let us know whether you think if you have an inclusive digital project example to share today. Yes, no. So there are 24 of you already. So let us know whether you think you have an inclusive digital project example to share. Project example of an inclusive and digital something. So we see already that there are some yeses. Very nice. Some of you are not sure. So we'll see. We absolutely understand that maybe the definition of what is inclusive still is a bit open, and we should discuss about that too. So thank you very much. So those who said yes, please think also how you could introduce us to your project in 1 minute. So we'll have this chance for you to share those. So have them ready, and we would love to hear from you more. And let's have a look at the last question. So what question do you have for today? Maybe there is something very concrete you would like to know, or maybe there is something that you are asking yourself since a while and you would like to get this answer maybe today. So use the chance now to put your question here. So the speakers can then also maybe address that already in their talks, or we can just see where we should put the focus of our discussion today. So how to overcome accessibility in social inclusion projects. So question of accessibility, how to be inclusive with people that have no digital access. Black Lives Matter, absolutely. How to reach youth that is at risk of digital exclusion. How to include fewer opportunities in digital projects in order to be really inclusive. How can the digital world help with inclusion? How to motivate young people to participate. How doing virtual youth exchange when the youth don't have a laptop. So it's also connected with inclusive tools that we see here. Is digital youth work sexy? Let's see how much that has to do with inclusiveness too. Current trends, how to reach out digitally and access connection devices. Can the digital inclusion topic be referred to the racist issue in Europe? Interesting question, connected for sure with the Black Lives Matter we just saw. What we need for digital inclusion, whether there is a special equipment needed. How inclusive are the thoughts about inclusion? Okay, a bit more philosophical approach here too. How to be fun for different youth groups. How use digital youth work to support formal education. Let's see whether we have space for that today. How to stay connected to reality still in these virtual spaces and to make a real impact with those projects. Once again, inclusive tools, how to overcome language difficulties. So we see many questions starting with how and looking for very concrete answers. So let's see whether we can address them also in our discussion, and maybe the examples that you also brought will help us in addressing those. So please now finish posting and writing your question and send it in. Thank you very much. We are moving on, and this event wouldn't be possible with also other people here.
Exactly. It wouldn't be possible with our graphic recorder. Let's say it's Adina from visualmind.lt from Lithuania. Thanks a lot for supporting us a lot in making some visualization out of the content some people bring in here, and also US audience.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Share it, so you can find them all on social media. Yeah, share it and have a visual reminder for yourself for what will happen today.
Thanks a lot, Adina. And then we also have Ricarda Molchilnik, who is from werdedigital.at from Austria, and she is our master of Zoom and hosts us today. You're muted, Ricarda.
Thank you so much for having me. What a good mistake. Yes, happy to help out. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ricarda. Thank you, Adina. And we also have Inge and Katarina from the project management team with us today. Thank you for being here with us. And we see you are waving and clapping. Lovely. So what about we just start? And first speaker today is Adina Marina ţERBAN, who is a youth researcher and a youth worker also from a grassroots youth NGO, which is called Center for Sustainable Community Development in Romania. And she is working with mixed abilities groups internationally. And together with Dan, who will be speaking after her, they are both part of the pool of European youth researchers, which is a pool that's been coordinated by the European Union and Council of Europe partnership in the field of youth. So she works, Adina works on projects related to social inclusion, youth participation, and digitalization. So today, Adina would like to talk about quite a bit about the aspects of accessibility that we see that are also of question and of relevance to all of you. So Adina, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar where, well, looking now at the questions, it's a wonderful place to discuss and to reflect. And we would just need a super force, a sort of Superman that would help us with answering all those questions. But definitely there are challenges that we all face in youth work, youth research, and wonderfully in youth policy as well. Yeah, I would somehow share a bit because the question related to, okay, do you have a good practice to share? It came to my mind that I could share examples from practice before pandemic, because of course that all life changed now with pandemic. But anyway, you know, before moving to what's changed, indeed, through the very short presentation that I've been trying to prepare, I'll just try to reflect a bit on what we had before in terms of accessibility. And of course, to come up with another set of questions, not that we didn't collect before with the mentee, but to reflect a bit on what's relevant for practice somehow. And how did I get to that? Well, last year, the Youth Partnership had been running a wonderful project trying to look at social inclusion and digitalization, because most of us would have some experience in running social inclusion projects. Then digital, either if we like it or not, it's part of our lives. Yeah, so we're somehow all online. I'm just wondering if all online. But anyway, looking at the relationship between the two, when it comes to young people, it's definitely a complicated relationship. Yeah, because it's very recent that youth research started to look at the project. It's also very recent that digital youth work somehow started shining in Europe, because there were some wonderful people doing that, but it was not somehow for everyone. And definitely youth policy would start thinking about that and responding more in practice. Because before thinking of social inclusion, we definitely had some safety nets. So we knew that young people would need some employment opportunities, that they need education opportunities, that they need family and a lot of people around to support them. But what about digital? Is it a new safety net? And yeah, that's somehow how we start looking at the project. And I was part of the wonderful team that came up with the study. I'm also sharing the link there on social inclusion, digitalization, and young people, where we tried to look a bit at what existed back there to see if the policymakers put in place some tools and instruments that link the two topics, if youth workers were already responding through platforms, and of course, if young people were doing themselves some great things. Of course, that when you look at that study, you'd see, well, but it's not enough. Of course, it's not enough, because we launched it in April. So the study was somehow ready at the beginning of this year. And what happened in March? It's the lockdown. So we collected practices the last year, but in fact, the practices that we collected are now just a reference, because the whole life would look different now with the pandemic. Of course, that looking at the EU policy agenda, we would also raise some questions regarding the way young people were somehow looked at, because of course we have a wonderful framework of policies, we have some programs, but somehow young people are with all citizens, and of course that thinking of different groups of young people, they are approached like within a great umbrella. So here are the policies and programs, so do whatever you can with that. Of course, that when we had the pandemic and everyone had to be online, all young people had to be online, no? Because this is how we do education nowadays, this is how we look for jobs nowadays, this is how we organize meeting with friends. But we're really all young people online at the moment, because here's the question, were young people before pandemic online? Of course not. And you say, well, why do we need that reflection when we knew that there were plenty of young people who did not have the opportunity to understand the digital world? Of course that we are far from the wonderful equal participation opportunities for all. But I take it as a challenge for everyone in the youth triangle, yeah, to try to come up with some answers. And of course, now I'm speaking as a researcher, but I always go back to my wonderful colleagues in practice, and youth workers and youth NGOs did some great activities. And of course, we are thankful for what happened. But again, I'm going back to looking at what's happening with the youth mobility and with the youth work activities in practice. And I'm just wondering, are we really inclusive? And then moving to the digital life nowadays, is that really accessible for everyone? And there's a set of great activities that I've been involved with before. And yeah, I love them because they're really my favorite projects. And these are the mixed abilities, international mobilities, where we stopped thinking of trying to make the project and to have some great activities. And we took that challenge on trying to make them really accessible and trying to adapt all the methodologies we had to really working with all groups of young people. I also have a reference there because in 2017, together with a wonderful colleague from Turkey, with Elif Serbest, we tried to look at these projects and to see where's the accessibility there. Of course, that those projects were not perfect because you have people with different abilities, because we really don't like to call them disabilities, coming together and really try to benefit of all these great learning opportunities that were in place. Life-changing experiences and trying to learn a bit more in a different way about empathy, about competencies development. But then again, pandemic, and we had this great set of great activities that were happening in the offline world, the mixed abilities projects that now I'm just wondering if they're still there. And if all the great activities we do online are really accessible for everyone. I'm just trying to look even at this opportunity we have now. So being part of this webinar, is it really inclusive for everyone? And that's why it's a question that I'm launching, and I'm inviting everyone to answer to that in the chat. And how could we make it really inclusive? And thinking about that, when I was drafting these very few slides, I was trying to think of my friends who are part of the international mixed ability projects, and to think if my presentation would be really accessible for everyone. I still have, this feeling that is not really accessible, that I maybe used too much text, or that the language I put there is not really accessible, or that some of my friends who are part of the activities before to simply not have the equipment that would allow them to be part of this project. Of course, that as I told you, it's a presentation where I was just trying to raise some questions related to accessibility and on how to make youth activities accessible in the digital area, because we are thinking of the youth mobility activities and of what's happening next. Yeah, so we have the crisis now, and how's the autumn going to look like? And are we staying with the same activities starting with the spring on? So are we really delivering inclusive activities in the online world? And of course, if online, how to make them accessible? And I've seen that it was a wide range of questions that we had there from the audience on trying to find an answer on how to make them accessible. And again, I think it's a challenge that we should all approach, either if we like it or not. So if the audience would ask for less colorful presentation to have them accessible, that's it. We have to make them less colorful and less dynamic, but to have them inclusive. And I'm also wondering what would be the role of the virtual communities in trying to ensure the accessibility for all young people in the digital world. So I would say that it's a presentation full of questions, adding them to the list that you had there. And I would be extremely grateful if we could start up a dialogue, why not even a working group, on how to make the digital youth mobility activities inclusive in the new reality as it is now.
Thanks a lot, Adina, for your presentation. I think there are a few questions which are more content-wise about your giving some examples, but we will come to it afterwards when we also had our second input, our second talk. And therefore, I'm happy to introduce to you Dan MOXON. Some of you may know him. He's the director of People, Dialogue and Change, value-driven company based in the UK, which is focusing on inclusive youth participation. He's also a member of the pool of European youth researchers coordinated by the partnership between the Council of Europe and the European Commission, as Adina too, and he was the chief editor of a book on social inclusion, digitalisation and young people that will be, these are his words, published or printed as soon as COVID let them, the researchers, right? And he will talk about accessibility as just one part of social inclusion. And he will also talk about especially how do we understand virtual communities, maybe versus geographical communities, how we understand them. And maybe we get to know a bit more about the publication. Let's see. So Dan, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. Yeah, just to add, my pronouns are he and him as well. I think I really want to pick up and start with this question of, do we have concrete examples to share? And to really explain a little bit about that, because the book, which will be coming out as soon as printing is allowed under COVID, hopefully, is linked to the study Adina was talking about. And really the starting point we came from was to try and look for good policies, good practices on the topic of, or on the intersection between inclusion and digitalisation. And I'm going to share my screen with you through this, and there'll be a Menti code again with a new code, but it's just a kind of slightly more interactive version of slides. The question that is in my mind when we start these things is, I think if I go back 1 or 2 years, there was really a sense in the youth sector that putting something online just made it more inclusive somehow. We know that our projects can always be more inclusive. Many of them are not inclusive enough. And there was a little bit of a belief that if you put something online, it just makes it more inclusive automatically. And I'd be interested to know whether you believe that's the case. So you used the Menti before, you can go to the same website and add in a different code this time, 21, 30 and 3, and tell me what you think here. Because really for me, this is what a lot of our work recently has been challenging, is this idea that actually things are automatically inclusive online. And when it comes to the sort of idea of, can we share concrete examples of good practices? I think I would be quite open and say, I've seen very few examples of really good inclusive practice that uses digital tools. So what I can do for you, and I'm glad I'm seeing a lot of no's here in this, is share to you a little bit around what I think some of the barriers to inclusion are, and what I think some of the things that we need to be thinking about to make our online work inclusive. But I'm not sure that I've necessarily got the solutions so much as the questions. I can see there's some overwhelming agreement here that putting something online doesn't make it more inclusive. So let's look at a little bit around accessibility and inclusion and what those things might mean and the differences between them, and what are the things that prevent things being inclusive. I should say straight up, my definition of social inclusion is really about, are things equally accessible to people irregardless of what social group they're from, whether that's having a disability, being from a particular ethnic group, gender, sexuality. I'm thinking of inclusion in this way rather than intergenerational inclusion of young people. This is the first barrier to exclusion, and this is the amount of access that people have to the internet. This chart, very brief, roughly shows the internet access by household in 2018 for each European country. And what you'll see in some countries, if you look at, say, Bulgaria here, only 80% of households have internet access. Some more people will have access by a mobile phone, but what that makes me think about when I'm thinking of inclusion is, okay, who's in this 20% that don't have access? And the people that are in those groups will typically be two groups. One will be people in rural areas where there's poorer infrastructure, and this may apply more in some countries than others. And the other factor will be related to poverty, people in lower income brackets. And of course, the important thing about that is if you are from an ethnic minority background, if you're a trans person, if you're a young person with a disability, you're more likely to also be to have a lower income because of the way inequality works. So actually this whole group of people who do not have internet access are the people that are already the most marginalized and excluded. So that's a very important thing just to consider straight away when you're talking about putting things online, is that you're automatically excluding some people. The next factor to talk about, and I'm going to explain what these things mean, is what Adina was referring to as accessibility. And I'd like to give full credit to a writer called Roman Benari, who's got a brilliant chapter in this book, where he looks at what makes the digital tools that we use accessible to people with disabilities. And he uses a thing called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And he says that actually the tools that we use, the platforms, things like Zoom, things like Moodle, these kind of things, first of all, they need to be perceivable. The user should be able to perceive the content through the senses, whether that's sight or hearing, either through the browser or with assistive technology. So you actually need to be able to see, read and hear what's going on. If you were trying to use a screen reader right now to understand what's going on in this screen, you wouldn't be able to. The second thing that makes something accessible is that it needs to be operable. The user needs to be able to interact with all the controls and performs and the functions through the keyboard or the mouse or with a supportive device. So if you were trying to, again, do this screen, you had a mobility challenge, you would need various adaptive technology to make it possible for you to work the mouse and the keyboard. And of course, affording those is an issue. It needs to be understandable. It needs to be in a language that people trying to use it can understand. And that's both about simplicity of content, but also if we're talking seriously about inclusion, that's also about using different national languages. And it needs to be robust. And that means that the platform you're using needs to work on lots of different browsers, lots of different mobile phones, lots of different software. Saying you have to be logged on Windows using Microsoft X with fully installed Zoom starts to exclude more and more people. And I would be honest and say, I think if we look at the youth sector and whether we're really assessing ourselves in these kind of standards, I don't think we are in the platforms we're using. 2 or 3 months ago, most of the youth sector didn't know how to plug in Zoom. So I think we're really a long way from trying to really think through whether the tools that we're using fit these kind of standards. This is accessibility to me, but it's only one part of inclusion. The other part of inclusion is the messages that are given off by the community that you're creating online. This is a picture of a Facebook group, and I'm going to show you some quite fairly radical content here. And you can see that in this Facebook group, it gives off very clear signifiers about who is and isn't welcome in this group. It gives off messages and spaces about what's going on in this space were you to choose to join it. One of the big differences between doing what you might call the traditional kind of learning mobilities we used to do and the virtual ones is you are creating an online community or a space that you're bringing people into. And the messaging, the imagery, the things that you use in that space gives off signifiers, gives off information about how people should act, how people should behave, and what's going on in that platform. And that's completely independent of the technology you're using. To give you an example of that, this is a website called 4chan, which runs on a particular bulletin board platform. And it's a very, very right-wing, hate-filled and racist community. Whereas this is a website called Bunkerchan, which is a very, very extreme left-wing community that runs on exactly the same technology. So it's about the culture that comes out in that space and the way that people moderate it, the way that people facilitate it. The same way that if you were working in a youth club or a youth project, you would think about these things. You need to think about these things in an online space. To give you an example of that, I was really taken by this image I saw on Instagram the other day, and this is perhaps bringing things a little bit closer to home. And it was posted by Oxford Youth Strike. So that's Oxford, where Oxford University is, a very wealthy, privileged town. And they're making a show of support for the Black Lives Matter movement. But I think the language that's in here is really interesting and gives us signifiers. It says, we don't want to speak for them. but instead make space for them to speak for themselves. What that tells me about Oxford Youth Strike is it isn't particularly a space that's led by people of colour, because it's very othering the way people are being talked about there. It's very much saying we are a group of white people showing support for people of colour. Now, I might be reading too much just into that one statement there, but it gives off a very particular message about who's the dominant cultural group in that setup and in that group. So these kind of messages that we use are all quite important. I'd be interested to know what you think this message tells you about the youth group behind it. You might come to very different perspectives from me, and it's obviously there's a lot more to this youth group than that one space. But I think that, so please feel free to put up any comments on this when I'm speaking. But I think the general point is that what makes virtual mobility so different from, let's call it traditional mobility, is we are bringing people into spaces that we are creating, into communities that we are creating that are detached from the geographic communities. And that gives us space to allow communities and values and spaces to develop that can be quite different. And so actually thinking about how we might use that to make sure that spaces are welcoming to lots of different types of people, to make sure that we attract the people that from all sorts of background into those spaces is quite important. You can see already in this, you've got very different perspectives on what that messaging gives off and what it doesn't give off. So in all of the things we're doing, these kind of messages would be reinforced in different sorts of ways, depending on how we're creating it. So that for me is kind of the final take home really. And this idea of what's a virtual community is something that's a little bit different from a physical community and can be a little bit separated. So we have the space to create new communities that can be more inclusive for people, but we also have the space online to create communities that are very exclusive to people. I'm going to stop screen sharing at that point. So yes, I think I'd be quite open and say we don't necessarily have many great examples to share, because I think this is still a point where the sector's at, is really thinking about what these things mean. I'm sure I've gone over my time, so I'll stop speaking there.
Thanks, Dan. You're actually not, so there's a few minutes left, but thanks for your input. There is a question by Francesco, and I think he's referring to the name you called Benari, I think.
Yes.
What book have you been talking about?
This is the book that will be coming out soon from the partnership between the Council of Europe and the European Union. It's called Social Inclusion, Digitalisation and Young People. Basically, we're waiting for us to be allowed to use the printers to distribute it. So hopefully autumn time. I'm hoping when society's collapsed, it will be like a text that people can find in the rubble afterwards to rebuild society with.
Okay, great.
Lovely. So I would like to remind you that you can at any moment post the question to the chat or raise the blue hand, and we will know that you want to ask the speakers or just join the discussion. Maybe you have an example that you think is really something we should know about, so use the chance. In the meanwhile, since we already were sitting for around 40 minutes here, some of us even a bit longer, so I would like to invite you now to energize a bit, and we have something fun and very much connected with the title of this series of event ready for you. So for that, you will need to stand up from where you are sitting right now, and Ricarda will show us how it will move on. So please, everybody stand up. Yes, and Ricarda, I think we need to... I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. Okay. So as you see, you will see some, maybe Ricardo, you could also share the sound of the computer.
Sorry.
Okay, so everybody get ready. As you see, we will do some just dance. So it is a dance karaoke. So you will see, you will hear some music, and you will see some concrete that you need to do, and let's try to follow it. It will bring us a bit more movement, a bit relaxation, and will energize us. Ricarda, are we ready to move it?
We are.
Great, so let's move it.
I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. You like to move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. Woman, you're nice, sweet, fantastic. Big ship on the ocean, that's a big Titanic. Woman, you're nice, sweet, high energetic. Big ship on the ocean, that's a big Titanic. Move it. You're physically fit, physically fit, physically fit. Woman, you're nice, sweet, fantastic. Big ship on the ocean, that a big Titanic. Woman, you're nice and sweet, high energetic. Big ship on the ocean, that a big Titanic. Woman, you're nice, sweet, fantastic. Big ship on the ocean, that a big Titanic. Woman, I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. You like to move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. You like to move it.
Great, congratulations to all those who won the Jazz Dance Move Karaoke. I hope you are not out of your breath.
Thanks a lot, Evaldas, for this little dance. I think it was a bit too fast, so I had to invent my own moves, I think, at a certain point. Thanks a lot. Yeah, so I hope we are energized enough now to hop into our discussion. And as Evaldas said, feel free to really raise your hand with a blue hand, as I explained at the beginning, or send your questions in the chat. And we are also definitely inviting the people who in the beginning thought they have a good practice project to actually present that. But in order to give you a bit of time to send and to raise your hand, I would ask the question to both of you, Adina and Dan. There was a question by Marek, which I found quite interesting. Does delivering something online make it less inclusive than more inclusive? Starting with the question you raised, Dan, and this goes a bit in the direction where you see also the opportunities in this online, let's say, when it comes to inclusion. I don't know who wants to start, Dan. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, Adina.
You go, Adina.
Well, the Energizer was great. It was a good chance to stand up to do things. I'm just wondering if it was really accessible. Yeah, and it's the same with all digital activities. Well, we had that exclusion that happened with the physical activities that were taking place, and the same happens with the digital ones. The only difference is that the digital inclusion, it's only at the beginning. So I would say that there's more space for mistakes or for things that we would not really complete. As for the physical activities that we were organizing before, we had a bit more time to prepare them. I wouldn't say that they are less or more inclusive, the digital ones. There's just a different type of inclusion / exclusion. There's the digital gap that we have to overcome. And for me, there's also the time pressure, because at the moment, at least, everything had to be adapted very fast. And I'm just wondering if that was a clear and structured process, or we just, I don't know, just go with the flow. So delivering something online for me doesn't really look at the moment quite inclusive, but I think there's a lot of time and space to learn. I didn't run a study on that, so it's just my experience as a youth worker and some things I read about as a researcher.
I think for me the point is to recognize that nothing is ever perfectly inclusive or not inclusive. So with any type of project, whether that's online or in person, I think there's an important thing is to be monitoring who is taking part, working out who is excluded and who's included in the people who are joining your project, and then addressing the barriers. But there are some real potentials with digital work that face-to-face work doesn't offer. I mean, it can be particularly useful. Having said all of the stuff about challenges with accessing software for people with disabilities, actually it also enables a lot of access for people with chronic illness, people who would struggle to physically move from one place to another, assuming they have good software and broadband access and these kind of things. What digital does, I think it's important not to confuse the difference between scale and inclusion. So in theory, you can use digital tools to reach many, many more people than you can fit inside a youth club. So you can run a course for 1,000 people rather than 30 people, which in theory allows you to reach many, many more people. But if you're just reaching the same social groups, that's not more inclusive, that's just more. So making a difference between those is quite important. But with anything, it basically depends on how you apply it and what you do with it. And I would say it's about not starting with the assumption your work is inclusive or not inclusive, but asking and seriously monitoring who is included, what are the barriers to those who aren't, and how do we improve our work in future to make it more accessible and more inclusive.
Great. So I would like to remind you also that you can not only ask the questions in chat, but also come here with a cam and mic and just maybe not only a question, but also to share one of the examples that we know that there are here in the room. We have seen in the first Menti. And so what can we take out from this to the practice of youth work, Adina? What, you know, we have been quite general in our introduction so far. So what would you say would be at least the first step now for us as youth workers to take to our practice so we become more inclusive?
Go closer to young people, because this was a discussion that we had earlier in our breakout room when we were trying to get to know each other a bit better. I'm just wondering if with all the tools and instruments and platforms and everything we organize for young people, if we are really responding to the youth needs and interests. Of course, it's a pressure because there were activities and projects that we were running in the offline world, and then in March we had to move them in the online world. I'm just wondering if we had enough time to test all the plans that we had. So, okay, we just set up a set of webinars. I'm now speaking from experience because we had the Solidarity project that we were implementing and everything moved online. But it took us a while to understand how to run these webinars, when to run the webinars, and what content should be there to be attractive for young people. Because in fact, no, we all involved with this with Youth Matters. We are here to help young people to reach their full personal and professional potential. Yeah, so that's our role. And I'm just wondering if we are close enough to young people, if we know what are their interests, if we know what are their concerns. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty for everyone, but are we really close to young people? So I'll just go back to young people and test everything with them and do things with them as well, not for them.
And I think I would add to that and say not to assume that young people have a homogenous or the same voice or the same experience, and that in your practice to be thinking about conversations with people you want to work with or you're trying to engage with to find out what works for them, what's accessible for them, And what's accessible for one group and inclusive for one group may be very different for another. So to really, rather than starting with the assumption that your work is inclusive and that putting it digitally makes it more inclusive, just to assume that it is not, and to ask who is excluded, and then to start conversations with the people you know are more excluded to find out what can be changed about your work.
Thanks, Dan and Adina. I have a bit the feeling that this is the situation we are now in. So actually we were thrown in it, we try our best and all that. And I got your point that we have to go back to young people in order to find out what's their needs, but actually how to do that. So that's a bit the question in a moment. We are online in a way, and what would be your advice of finding out the next step for people who are actually trying out, experimenting, and want to find a way, a good way?
I can share what I did, or what we did as a small grassroots youth organization working in a village in southwestern Romania. Well, we had all these digital tools in place before. So with the ones who were on that group, it was easier because we're just calling or sending a message and then getting all the answers. But those were not the whole youth population in the village, because what I've noticed, and I'm always telling that to my colleagues, that I have the feeling that at times, and even now with all the digital world, we are very good in stimulating the participation of young people who are already there participating, and including the ones who are already included. So I think that's a brilliant thing that we all do, and we are all experts on that. And what we did was working with our young people who are online, somehow as ambassadors or facilitators, and opening up the dialogue with the ones who were not there. And they were not there in the online world because they didn't have the equipment, or they only had the smartphone that everyone was using for the education, and parents were sending messages to work, to colleagues at work, and identifying the other young people who are not online with their peers. Of course, you would say, well, that was an easy task for a village with 3,000 inhabitants, but what's happening if you have a million young people there? You do the same. You work with youth workers who are in contact with young people, and these young people would be in contact with other young people, of course, with the ones with whom you could identify. And I just have the feeling that there's still a huge gap, and I don't have an answer for that, to do the outreach and to go back to those young people who are not visible even before pandemic. And now, yeah, just the needs who came into my mind, what's happening with them. So it's a great effort that youth workers should be investing into outreach and then putting things in the digital world. Of course, there's double work for youth workers, and the wonderful solution would be to have a bigger number of youth workers who would be involved with that.
Yeah, I think for me that important of outreach is realizing that can be done digitally to a certain extent. I mean, you can never reach that cohort that doesn't have digital access, but I mean, with really good communications and informations campaigns, you can really actively target information, consultations, surveys, invitations to talk at young people you've never worked with who are in your city or your town or something like that. So, you know, paid for advertising and communications campaigns, inviting people to tell you what they would like from your youth project or your youth provision will give you some of those starting points and those answers, rather than continually asking the ones who you're already in touch with. I think that this cohort of people who don't have access to digital services, ultimately, I think the youth sector's role is probably just to accept that we can't use digital tools to reach them at this point. I think that's a bigger social issue than the youth sector can take on. I think that's a population-wide issue of inequality. So those of us who work in policy would perhaps want to advocate for this and realise when there's problems in our policies because of this. but I don't think it's realistic that the youth sector can provide digital access to the cohort of population that doesn't have it. So we just need to be mindful and aware of that level of inclusion there. There are some small scale initiatives that are interesting. I've seen, I think there were some youth organisations in Italy that were encouraging people to share their Wi-Fi with their neighbours, so they also had access as well as a kind of COVID measure. But ultimately, I think you're talking about long-term recognising that digital access is a human right, and there will always be a small cohort of people who, for varying reasons, don't have that digital access. But I think it's important to acknowledge that and recognise when we not use digital to replace face-to-face entirely.
Great, thank you, Dan. We have Snezhana who is raising her hand. Maybe you would like to, so please ask the question. Or
I would, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Well, actually, not on this line of conversation, I think about inclusion with a capital I would say, but I was thinking a lot about whether online, and I don't talk just about these kind of conversations that we have via Zoom or video conferencing, but let's say online courses that are not about synchronous, but they're asynchronous, whether they do actually support inclusion in the sense that they enable more time for people to deal with certain learning processes, where I feel that in residential context, we would throw a lot of pressure that things need to be done and people need to go through it fast. I have a feeling that sometimes these online spaces, especially if they're asynchronous, that they allow really for more time to things to be tackled, for more time for people to research, to process the learning, to maybe take the time for themselves. And at the same time, I think also another thing that they might be good at is to allow space for people who simply communicate differently. So they're not comfortable in these kind of, addressing 95 people in a Zoom, but they can write something where they could take time for themselves or reflect on their own, So again, it's not inclusion with a capital I in terms of different either disabilities or learning difficulties and so on, but maybe just simply for bringing more time and more space for people to go through the learning process. I don't know if that was, I think it's something that I'm wondering, so something that I'm still trying to figure out, and maybe it's also the question for Adina and Dan.
I can share a little bit. I've been digitalising a course that was a residential course to train young people with chronic illness in advocacy work. And because of COVID, we've been basically doing exactly what you've said, making it into an online sort of Pathright-based longer-term platform. And my experiences there are that time feels a lot more precious in that it's harder to build the interaction between people, which is what you miss a little bit. So what you can do in the webinar spaces becomes very cramped. What we sort of see is that offering what the digital space allows you to do is almost create a number of different pathways for people, so that almost as you've said, people who have different learning needs can navigate them differently. So we don't really expect 100% of the participants to do 100% of the activities. Some might get a lot out of watching the videos we've created, some might get a lot out of the interactive activities, some might get more of the webinars. So it does allow you to do that a little bit more easily. And it allows, in the way you've talked about sort of synchronous and asynchronous spaces, it does allow that potential for people to come in and out in different ways. I saw a really interesting project that was using online tools to engage young people with autism. And they basically had probably a cohort of about 1,000 young people with autism who were basically just on their email lists. And they could see that like 500 of those would stay on their emailing list for 6 months before feeling confident to even reply to a survey or a response to a consultation. And they might do that a couple of times before they actually joined the physical youth group. This was well before COVID times. So you can create a lot of different spaces that allow those pathways for people. But I think in some ways, some of that is also just about, if you do more things, you can be more accessible in a way. And that's maybe also true of face-to-face situations.
Well, if we talk about space, thanks, Dan, for sharing on the question and comment of Snezhana. Aurelian, who was also one of our speakers in the very first lab about virtual exchanges, was just reminding us that in our opening there were a speech on safe spaces and what is actually meant by that. And since you have been talking about virtual communities also, but the question goes to Adina as well, what do we understand under this safe space, and what is actually needed if we use this term? So, or is this something where a virtual community can rather be the safe space, and how for young people?
Well, indeed, it's extremely relevant and we need safe spaces. I'm just wondering if, again, in youth work, we really approach it theoretically and practically as it should be. Why saying that? Well, we started speaking about safety on internet a couple of years ago, and some states started doing their national strategies, and we somehow started training young people on that. But I'm just wondering what the results are, and now thinking that we need a lot of monitoring and about the indicators that we should be using to understand better what's safety on internet, and yeah, looking at figures. I'm just wondering if we all have those available. I would say that, yeah, in the digital world, safe place would exist the same way that they exist in the physical place when we speak of safety. And again, it's only at the beginning. So we do have the feeling that we should be focused on that, but then it's so much in the digital world that we're trying to understand that safety is just one of them. So I doubt that at the moment we are good enough to ensure these safe spaces for young people in the online world. And if we are, then the other youth workers should be trained on that. So if there's the knowledge, then it should be somehow promoted to others who are just at the beginning. Yeah, but I don't see it as a safe space for young people at the moment.
I think for me, there's two things that are important to emphasize. One is the internet is made up of multiple spaces. So you can't talk about on the whole whether it's safe or unsafe. And that spaces are safer, not necessarily fully safe at all times. So if I think of comparing it to a youth club, in a youth club, what I would do to create a space that's inclusive, respectful, and welcoming to people is you would start to thinking about the ground rules you're sitting down in that space, how homophobia, racism, sexism, these kind of things are dealt with. I'm sure you're all very familiar with that. The difference when you get online, it comes, I think, very much for where you start talking about synchronous and asynchronous interaction. So a youth club is a little bit like a Zoom chat. You can always be there in person. If I were to start being horrifically racist now, I'm very confident that Evaldus would challenge me on it and shut me down, as he would hold responsibility for that space. But maybe if we all join a Facebook group, and then at 2 o'clock in the morning, the Facebook group that's linked to the Move It project, people start doing similar things there or excluding people in ways there. You can't have that 24-hour kind of monitoring sort of position there. And there, I think we can learn a lot from what people in the gaming communities do and what chat room moderators do. I really like the work of an organization called Game Over Hate. I think they do some great things where they're talking a lot about community moderation and how you have moderators for a group that could be all sorts of different volunteers, moderators for an online space. And I can see someone says moderator or facilitator. I'm using moderator very specifically to mean something different from a facilitator. So a facilitator to me is someone who runs an activity. When I say moderator in this context, I kind of mean a custodian of the space, really, someone who may have the ability to approve or delete comments that appear in the chats, that may have the ability to ban someone from an online space if they act in a certain way. So a lot of this can be very much about how you create a culture of a space, how you set and make very clear what the ground rules of that space are. Snejana, you're right, it's very comparable to a residential in some ways. And if you think back to those images that I showed you of different online spaces straight away, that's really signifying what the tone of a group is about. So I really think that's where we need to be learning as youth workers, how we can apply our skills to create and keep safe physical spaces in an asynchronous setting, which is really what we need to do online. But at the same time, also recognizing some of the online spaces we work in are more like being in a public square. If you're in a tweet chat, for example, that's more like being in the town hall or the city square where anyone can come in and say anything. And as a youth worker, maybe you don't have the same responsibilities as a space you've specifically invited people into and encourage them to join and want to keep safer in that kind of way. So that would be my thoughts.
Dan, thank you. Please don't forget to share the links if you have or titles so we can look it up, the gamers and anything you think that would make, you were just mentioning now, I think it could be interesting also for us to follow up on that. We have Salvi's question from already a couple of minutes ago, and I think it's also a bit of a more general discussion. However, it is really connected with today's topic. So he asks how much something was really experimented for the specific digital dimension, or how much we just try to fit our online things in the digital ones. So Adina, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that, I was already mentioning it earlier that we didn't have enough time for that. So I just have the feeling that we moved, or at least I'm speaking a lot from the experience. We moved some of the things that we could move online with the competence and knowledge we had. And the others we're just thinking about. And thinking of the things we are doing, I would just like to go back on thinking about the youth work tradition because before speaking of digital youth work, I'm just going back to youth work. Historically speaking, there's just a lot of countries where, Romania is one of them. We've been learning a lot in the international projects and informally and in some national projects, but it's something you cannot study in the university. So we're struggling to train ourselves on delivering youth work services, and now we immediately have to jump to delivering digital youth work services. So that's why there's a lot of reflection on this youth work tradition. So before speaking of the digital youth work, again, it's a lot of reflection involved in that, and how to and again, going back to the safe spaces, I'm just wondering what young people would think of that. It's something that they expect us to offer, safety, or they already know something. It's just things they're just expecting from us that would come a bit with some ethics from the other activities we were doing and transfer them in the digital world.
I would go back to a few more detailed questions on the safe space again. Maybe for you, Dan. Again, there was the question how to create actually ethical guidelines for a space, a safe space. Is the starting point of human rights is the way forward is the question, and maybe also the question from Stefan on how people, and if I understand you right, Stefan, you can also switch on your mic, people in terms of all the people who are part of this community then could contribute to an inclusive environment.
Stefan, did you want to talk or shall I answer?
By all means, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think human rights is a brilliant starting point. But I guess for me, these processes are processes rather than standards in a way. So if I were to post, various human rights conventions in this chat and say, these are the rules, everyone follow them, it might not have a very huge effect. But starting dialogue, starting conversations about the way people in this space want to be treated, enabling people to shape that space with each other. Whereas, as an educator, you might be introducing the human rights dimension, the framework dimension into that. You might also have some kind of red lines that you feel it's unacceptable to cross. So it's that process of creating dialogue with the people in the community that you're creating that makes the space safer, rather than, you know, here's the specific detailed guidelines in a way. It's about the culture of respect, the culture of tolerance. But at the same time, I think that can be much more challenging when you start to work with very, very large numbers of people in a digital space. You know, having a dialogue with 30 people in a space is very different to having a dialogue with 1,000 people. But I think that continuous dialogue about tolerance, respect, understanding difference, dignity, these principles that underpin human rights, and being clear on how people who cross those boundaries will be treated in that community, whether they'll be prevented from being part of that community moving forward, is sometimes very important. The kind of non-youth work digital spaces tend to go a little bit down these routes of, let's have very, very strict guidelines and you get banned if you're not part of them, if you don't follow those. I wonder if in smaller communities, in youth workspaces, I would perhaps value the process a little bit more than the standards. But I mean, human rights is still a bottom line set of ethics for everything we do, I think. But it's also something we need to be active in promoting and working towards.
I would, Adina, if you don't want to add anything, I would go back to our title of the lab and focus a bit on the second part. And I'm wondering if in your book, which is still not printed and published, but hopefully soon, you analyzed also a little bit about the existing EU youth programs, and if yes, what did you find out? And maybe also about if you have written it down or not, but what would be a recommendation for future EU youth programs in order to bring this topic a bit forward, digitalization and social inclusion?
Well, yeah, it was a question about the book. I was coordinating the study, and we looked at the European framework, and speaking, European meaning the EU framework and also the Council of Europe policy document. And I think I was mentioning it earlier that there's a lot of the need for digital skills of all citizens. There's some point in the legal framework that would set up then the European programs in the field of youth, but not that much focus directly on digital competencies directly for young people. Of course, they're all citizens, but yeah, young people would, if they're the future, then we should be investing directly in them, clear policies and programs. And also in the study, you'd find that we looked at more than the European framework. We also looked at national and local examples where possible. And you'd find, for example, in Estonia, they have a wonderful set of programs and policies available. So there's some countries that manage to do that, and maybe we should be looking at those practices. And of course, now there's also the thing that for the formal education system, it's a lot that had been done, but for the youth organizations and for the youth field, it was less. So coming back to your question, the European framework is quite general. So probably for the future of the European programs, we should be looking more to young people, to their needs and interests in the physical or in the digital world. So if we want to see young people participating more in the digital youth work activities, then we should be looking at their interests and needs in the digital world.
Yeah, I think to build on that, my recommendations would be that people who want to work with digital tools should think more about community management rather than building apps. So to really focus on how do we manage and facilitate and grow online communities and spaces, because those are skills we have and we generally know how to do as a sector. It's just a case of applying those into an online space. I think we've focused a little bit too much on we need a new tool to do this. There's quite a lot of tools and platforms available online, various social media channels. So really trying to try different ways of community building in virtual spaces is probably important. And I really think at this point, as a whole, what the sector needs, I think it's still a bit premature to catalogue good practices. I think there are some out there we can certainly start to draw on and share a bit more, but actually just to experiment and to try things out, but to critically evaluate them at the end, and rather than deliver a digital project and say this was an example of amazing practice, be prepared to say, no, actually there were these problems with it. It didn't work well for these reasons, and this is what we learned from it. And I know that's very hard to do in the environment of a funding scheme where you're basically expected to deliver something to show you've used the money effectively. But I do think we need to just try some things, see if they work, evaluate them, and learn from them before we can get to that sharing the more practical ways.
So the time for discussion now is over, and we thank you very much for all the questions, and we are sorry if we couldn't reply to some of them. We still have something ready, and I will tell in a moment where you will be able to continue this discussion. So to sum up what has been going on in the last we have seen that accessibility is to be thought not only from the technical point of view, but also content-wise, whether the language that we are using is also understandable. And then also internet could be automatic and exclusive factor. However, maybe a combination of both is exactly the solution that we should be looking rather into. And we have learned also some concrete accessibility factors that maybe can help us as a concrete guideline in when we are checking whether it's accessible, what we are creating or not. And they have been perceivability, the factor of being operable, understandable, and robust. So something maybe concrete in the field where we still see that we need maybe a bit more concrete guidelines than we have so far. What we also have seen that for developing inclusive digital aspects in our work, we just need more time for experimenting and creating specific tools for digital environment. We shouldn't be only talking about translating the ones that we already have in the offline area, but just to also think digitally. And the discussion of virtual communities is something that we already met in virtual exchanges in our first lab. And we see that they are different from physical ones. They can be both. They can be exclusive. They can be also inclusive. And what maybe makes our life a bit easier is the fact that we should just accept at the moment the fact that we as the field of youth work cannot solve infrastructural problems, for example, when it comes to the digital access. Then we saw that also in learning process, asynchronous aspects can actually be more inclusive than in the offline ones, with different learning pace that can be used in that kind of a setting. And then Dan was also mentioning that we as youth workers, we already have the skill set for moderating communities, both for offline, but also for online world. So why not to build on those skills that we have and talk rather about community management than about creating new tools, because there are plenty of those already. Safe spaces, maybe the thing that I'm taking with myself is just getting back and closer to young people and creating not for them, but with them. So some aspects that at least I have in my notebook, I hope that you also have some in yours. And now, as I promised, we have something ready for you that we would like to introduce you today. There has been already some initiative from some of the participants, and we absolutely agree that this kind of a process of 3 weeks that we are here having needs to be bundled up somehow with one communication tool. And we hope that it is not too much exclusive for some of you. And we have created a Facebook group, and in the chat you will find a link to it. So if you are still not added to the Facebook group, go there. You might need to answer one extra question before you are allowed to enter the closed event group, and that's where we would like the discussions to continue. So not only about today's topic, but also in general about digital mobility and all the aspects we have been discussing. So please join the Facebook group if you want, and you will get also updates. We will try to communicate with you not only through the emails that Katarina has successfully been doing so far, but also maybe just some exchange between us. Also, we will put the links and any updates that are coming in. So connect, network over there, and keep your discussions.
Thanks, Evaldas. Actually, yes, the Facebook group, and I saw that what Dan was mentioning is just very true. So I think it's a joint responsibility from here. And yesterday we were thinking about some group rules needed in order to build a safe space. Even this Facebook group, which is connected to an event. I would be really happy if we all together could form that a bit, and also think about other channels if people are not included there. So, well, but next step, we actually would like to know, how did you like this third lab on social inclusion and digitalization? Therefore, we go another time back to Menti. So I would ask you, taking another browser or your smartphone, and go on menti.com and just put in the code 660880, so 660880. And most of you may already know it, but it's more comparable. Then we ask you again, how did you like it? So the event in general, the content today, and the moderation. So it's 1 to 5 points. How did you like it? We are still waiting a bit. We have half of the people now on the slide, I think. So menti.com, and then you put in the code 660880. I guess the event in general was quite okay with 3.7, the content too. It's more medium. I think what we always got is, if you concentrate more on the abstract content, then people want more practice, or the other way around. It's a pity that we haven't, that you haven't shared so many projects which you found maybe inclusive, but it could be that you then after our speeches just thought it's maybe not that inclusive. Well, I hope that we are going to share more in the Facebook group on our experiences, but also on questions. And please, Dan, also share a few more maybe material on how to actually facilitate communities online. Great, so we can go to the next slide, which is more detailed. Now we want to know from you what you are actually taking out. So in one word, what is what you take out of today? A lot of questions, knowledge, that's great. a long way to inclusion, definitely. Another question, community, inspiration, still a lot of research. Actually, this is also what we got from Adina and Dan. There's still a lot to do, especially with the change of our world. A little bit, yeah, limits and opportunities, more questions, courage, expertise, challenges, knowledge, and a lot of questions are getting bigger too. We wait a bit longer, have half of the people now on the slide. Inclusion is relative. Also, somebody is taking out community, not building more apps, but rather maybe getting along with the ones we have, probably. Larger vision, diversity, inclusion is possible. That's a positive way, great. It can be, same direction. A burning brain, somebody's also taking out. Great, so finish your word on what you're taking out. There's no new one more, so I think we are going to the next slide. And that's any other kind of feedback you have for us, please just share. So it's really about anything which is still in your mind you would like to feedback. We are happy to get this feedback from you and taking it always into account. Great as always, nice work, great moderation. Thank you. Keep it up. We have 2 more, so we will tell you. And I hope we are continuing these discussions. Interesting and inspiring, 2 short talks. Yeah, I mean, time-wise, we already thought that it's definitely follow-ups needed. More resources. I hope we can use the Facebook group really for that now, to share more resources. 2 more years of continuing the debate, at least, I would say. Nice contribution, thanks to our speakers too. People enjoyed it, thanks. British English is always awesome, yeah, would also love to speak it. We need to move it, definitely. Impressive moderation, thanks a lot again. More Dan needed. That's a compliment to you, Dan. I think more Adina needed too. We generally need more research and some impact we can then show and get along with what else is needed, what is found out. More good practices. Actually, yes, I'm really giving it back to you. So I'm pretty sure that there are out a few interesting projects to share. I would be happy if we can do that now. Great. Yes, so please, there are still some people missing, maybe they still write something down. If not, you're not forced, of course. Thanks a lot, cool knowledge. Great, and one more thing is about our open feedback box. I would just want to share with you the link. Somebody maybe already did it, no? We have an open feedback box, as you already know. Oh yeah, thanks, Ricardo, great. Yeah, if you can show it. We also added one more column on an inclusion and digitalization. So if you have any project tips and ideas, that could be also here in a column where we have an overview of all the feedback regarding the Move It, yeah? So of course you can share it in a Facebook group, but here is rather be a bit more focused on sharing good practice ideas or tips you have. Great. That's
so
it about
what's coming next? Ricarda, can we see the visual journey that is left in front of us? And we still have 2 more events in the series of Move It. So on Monday, we will be looking into the EU youth programs, particularly Erasmus Plus Youth and European Solidarity Corps. And there we have representatives also from European Commission and 4 further NAs who will share their experiences, how they have been dealing with the current situation, but also we will think a bit further on what are exactly our needs, what needs to be considered while developing also the new generation of youth programs. So join us there on the 15th of June. We will be having also a bit longer session. It will start at 2 and we will finish after 4 because we want to have also a bit of an exchange between us and between you, so that you can also share your experiences and what you have seen going on in your country, in your projects, and so on. So use the chance and join us over there. And then on Wednesday, so just a bit more than in 1 week, we are closing Move It series, and there will be the moment and the possibility for all of us to foresee the future. So to think what youth mobility would look like, will look like, should look like in 10 years, in 2030. So also a bit maybe leaving this all COVID bubble behind us, hopefully by that time, and seeing what does it do with us and what does it change in general in our work, in how we think about youth mobility, whether it's digital or residential. So you can also find more information in our event website. There you will also find these lovely visualizations by Agne from Visual Mind. Follow the link that I have just posted in the chat and join the Facebook group so we can keep in touch even after 17th of June. So Ricarda, what about some music so we can say a nice goodbye to all of you? And thank you all, over 70 participants still there. We are very happy to see you. We also feel that most of you are joining all of the events and there is a little community coming to life. So let's live it further and let's keep it on our Facebook group. And let's see each other on Monday.